Judah Productions.
Shameful, and I am sorry.
We have no idea how many wives, girlfriends, children inherited the disease and also died or were forever crippled by its effects.
For 40 years, the U.S. government operated Public Health Service conducted what was known as the Tuskegee Syphilis Study, one of the darkest chapters in American history. Now, over 40 years after the study ended, we still don't know, and might never know, the full extent of its effects. And the study might have continued if not for a 1972 article from Associated Press reporter Jean Heller.
Everyone who knew about this, to my way of thinking, everyone who knew about this and didn't blow the whistle, that didn't shout to high heaven, "This is wrong," is culpable.
Syphilis was considered a national health crisis in the early 20th century.
You don't know a thing about syphilis, except that you've got it.
And many doctors at the time thought syphilis and other medical complications were affected by race. To study the disease, researchers found a population of poor, black, syphilitic sharecroppers in and around Tuskegee, Alabama during the Great Depression. Nearly 400 of the participants had syphilis, while another 200, the control group, did not. In the end, as many as 100 men died from complications related to untreated syphilis, and the message was very clear. Black deaths mattered.
Medical doctors deliberately let them die, wanted them to die, for what they could discover from their bodies later.
How old were you when you first learned about the Tuskegee study?
23.
The day you published this story, the day the story was published, did you know what was getting ready to happen?
Yeah. I knew it would be explosive. After the story broke, and there was this incredible public outcry, Senator Kennedy had held very, very public congressional hearings on this.
If they had been white, your public health service would never have agreed to do this study in the first place. They wouldn't have dared.
The study and the aftermath are well documented in films and books, but there are still things we might never know, and for Heller, that goes back to the very beginning.
I still have not heard the answer to the very simple question of why. They should have been able to determine after the first 3 or 4 autopsies that the inside of a black person ravaged by syphilis looks identical to the inside of a white person, and stop the study.
Beyond that, Heller believes there's no way to know just how many people were directly or adjacent
from getting a cure that could save their lives, just so that they could study the long-term effects of their condition if left untreated. You'd think I'd be lying, wouldn't you? Unfortunately, I'm not lying, so stay tuned because we have a very interesting episode today that just might blow your mind. Welcome to Vlogs of History. It's about the experiment. It pains me to talk about it, but I feel that we have to talk about it because it's something very important that really had a big impact on the way we conduct research today. We're talking about the Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment, an experiment that was conducted in the 1930s that lasted 40 years too long. Researchers wanted to know the long-term effects of syphilis if left untreated. Now, there was another study done a few years before that studied syphilis, but the study was done on the white population. Unfortunately, people were still racist enough to believe that whites and blacks were affected differently by disease, and that's why you have the Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment, an experiment solely dedicated to studying the long-term effects of syphilis on the black population. Before we go on, let's first define what syphilis is. Syphilis is a sexually transmitted disease, or STD, that's usually contracted by sexual intercourse, but can also be passed down from mother to child during pregnancy if the mother is infected. Syphilis has 4 stages, and depending on which stage you're at, the symptoms may vary. It's often called the imitator disease because it imitates the symptoms of other diseases. Its mortality rate is between 8 to 58% if left untreated, and simply put, if you can avoid having syphilis, well, you should. It's not something that you would want to have. The study recruited 399 infected patients from a small county in Alabama called Macon County. Now, Macon County was a very poor place. The residents were illiterate, uneducated, and had no medical care. In fact, some had never even seen a doctor in their lives before. So when the researchers came and offered them free hot meals and free medical care if they chose to participate in the study, you can be sure that a lot of them chose to sign up. As long as they came and did their tests, they would get free hot meals and free healthcare. This was so that they would be motivated enough to endure the very painful tests that were required for the study. Now here's where the problem kicks in. The researchers, they never told them that they had syphilis. Instead, they told them that they had bad blood, and the medication that they were being given, well, they were just placebos that had absolutely no effect on their health. Now, to be fair, when the study started in 1932, there wasn't a cure for syphilis available, so they weren't really doing anything wrong. They were just studying the long-term effects of syphilis if left untreated. The problem was when penicillin came around in the 1940s and then became officially accepted as the cure for syphilis nationwide, that the patients were purposely prevented from getting that cure just so that the study could go on. Even when a nationwide effort to promote penicillin and eradicate syphilis came to Macon County, they were still prevented from getting the treatment. Even during the World War, 250 men were drafted for the army only to be denied because they were infected with syphilis. Then again, they were prevented from getting a cure. Even in the 1950s and 1960s, when efforts were made to make research more ethical, nobody took the time to reevaluate the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. Nobody took the time to evaluate its ethics. Some of the nurses were worried about the ethical implications of their actions, but they had to follow the doctor's orders. There was nothing else they could do. The study was supposed to last only 6 months, but ended up lasting well over 40 years. It wasn't until Peter Buxton, the whistleblower in our story, that he saw what was going on and took his story to the New York Times, who published it on the front page. You can obviously imagine the public outrage that ensued. What followed after that were a series of bills and regulations that were meant to prevent such a thing from ever happening again. Whenever you did a study, now you had to inform your patients fully of what you were doing, you had to be completely transparent, and your study had to be up for review by a review committee. By the end of the study, there were 28 deaths directly linked to syphilis, 100 more from related complications, 40 of their wives were infected, and as a result, 19 children were born with syphilis. Those are very big numbers that I'm sad to say are part of our history. But hey, at least something good came out of this. We now have laws and regulations that prevent such a thing from ever happening again. Alright, so that was it for this week's episode of Vlogs of History.
In July of 1972, the Washington Star newspaper broke the story about the controversial Tuskegee Institute syphilis experiment. For 40 years, from 1932 until 1972, the U.S. Public Health Service, in partnership with Tuskegee, secretly studied the effects of untreated syphilis in African American men in Alabama. 600 black men, 399 with syphilis and 201 without the disease, were induced to participate in the experiment. Nearly all of them were poorly educated, impoverished sharecroppers. In exchange for participating, they were promised free medical exams, hot meals, and a burial stipend. The men with syphilis were not told they were infected and were not treated, even after penicillin was discovered to be an effective cure for the disease in the 1940s. Over the course of the experiment, 128 participants died of syphilis or syphilis-related complications. In 1972, when the paper exposed the details, the experiment was still ongoing. It incited public outrage over the unethical treatment of the participants, which led to the experiment's termination that November. The following year, the NAACP filed suit on behalf of the survivors. The federal government settled the lawsuit for $10 million. It also agreed to provide survivors and their infected family members with free medical services.
Hello everyone, this is Steve with SayItInLove.com. In light of racist white people being duplicitous about our black or melanated history, I want to post a series of videos that honor the unsung heroes as well as show the true history of how a lot of companies and people became rich. Take a look at this clip, and as always, I say this in love.
So today America does remember the hundreds of men used in research without their knowledge and consent. We remember them and their family members. Men who were poor and African American, without resources and with few alternatives. They believed they had found hope when they were offered free medical care by the United States Public Health Service. They were betrayed. Medical people are supposed to help when we need care, but even once a cure was discovered, they were denied help, and they were lied to by their government.
Today we are located in a structure which used to be a bank, but which now houses the Tuskegee Human and Civil Rights Multicultural Center, which is a museum in planning in order to preserve the history of the various ethnic groups in Tuskegee and Macon County, Alabama. Basically, there are three ethnic groups who have lived in this area: Native Americans, then European Americans, and Americans of African descent. Each of those persons have made substantial contributions in the field of human and civil rights, and this museum, when completed, will show the contributions that each made, and hopefully, as a result of that, we'll learn that we have a lot more in common, and we'll be able to learn how to live together better. The major exhibit that's on display at the Tuskegee Center is dealing with the Tuskegee Syphilis Study. The Tuskegee Syphilis Study was a study financed by the federal government, started in 1932. According to them, it was for the purpose of studying untreated syphilis in the Negro male. There had been, sometime before 1932, a discovery of quite a bit of syphilis in this area. Of course, syphilis is a sexually transmitted disease, which at that time, it was very difficult to treat. But in the 1940s, penicillin became available, so treatment was readily available. But these doctors were aware of that in Tuskegee and was able to convince the Surgeon General to permit them to engage in the study of Negro males. The way they went about doing it was very interesting. They selected a group of men, all African Americans, all rural, with very little education. They told them that it was a health program, and they were under the impression that they were being treated for whatever was wrong with them. They never told them what was wrong. They examined them. They took their blood. It started out to be a short-term study. It ended up being a 40-year study that had no protocol, no rules and regulations. And the men did not realize that they were involved in the study until it became public in 1972. There were 624 men originally involved in the Tuskegee Syphilis study. Over a period of time, many of those individuals died. We really don't have a record of exactly how many, but some died. The human body, however, has a tremendous capacity to heal itself. So many of these men, over a period of time, some did end up eventually getting treatment. But many of them died. Many of them, even at the end of the study, they still found that there were some positive symptoms of syphilis. And at that time, all of the persons who were still in the study, as well as the spouse of the syphilitic and children, were given an opportunity to be examined. But that was at the end. These men, they were never told that they had a deadly disease. They were never told that this really was an experiment. They were never told that they were not, in fact, being treated, and they weren't given a choice as to whether they should or should not. They thought it would help themselves, thought it would keep them in good health so that they could take care of their families. And then when years later we read stories and we find out that what you really had was a planned study to not treat them, not tell them they were being treated, they ended up giving a list of these men to all of the doctors in the area and advised them not to treat them. And even when penicillin became available in the 40s, a question came up about it, and they decided, notwithstanding the Alabama law, which at that time said you must treat people who had syphilis because penicillin was available, they still didn't treat them.
I believe science is one of the most important things that we have. But sometimes science experiments. Things done and then good can turn very bad. Like in the story, and of the person I'm going to tell you about now. I'm going to tell you I'm going to tell you a story about the Tuskegee syphilis study. From 1932 to 1972, a period of 40 years, the U.S. government, in conjunction with the U.S. Health and Human Services and Tuskegee University, injected hundreds of black men with the sexually transmitted disease known as syphilis. What's worse is many of them died as a result and were never told that they had this. A reason for this could be that the U.S. government enlisted the help of African American healthcare providers of an African American healthcare provider named Eunice Rivers, who was responsible for basically rolling these men to this barbaric study. He promised them women, boys, free medical care, and food.
Good evening. I'm Janella Butler, Associate Dean of the Graduate School. I'm standing in tonight for Dean Marcia Landolt, who is out of town. We're here tonight because of a generous gift to the University of Washington. The Visiting Professorship Program was created in 1961 with a bequest from the estate of Mr. John Dance. Mr. Dance came to Seattle in the early 1900s and became a very successful businessman. He is perhaps best known for the chain of movie theaters he developed. John Dance was a self-educated man who read widely and liberally. He was fascinated by scientific developments and was particularly interested in the philosophy of humanism. In creating this endowment, his goal was to bring distinguished men and women who have concerned themselves with the impact of science and philosophy on man's perception of a rational universe to the University of Washington. Mr. Dance's wife, Jessie, shared this vision and augmented the endowment with additional gifts until the time of her death. Please now join me in expressing appreciation for this invaluable gift to the university and to the citizens of the region. Our speaker tonight, Vanessa Northington Gamble, will be introduced by Dr. Melissa Austin, who is both a professor of epidemiology in the School of Public Health and Community Medicine and the director of the Institute for Public Health Genetics. Professor Austin?
Thank you very much. It's truly a pleasure to be here this evening to introduce Dr. Vanessa Northington Gamble to her dance lecture here at the University of Washington. I'd like to start by being sure to acknowledge the sponsors of Dr. Gamble's visit, including the Institute for Public Health Genetics, the Center for Ecogenetics and Environmental Health, the Schools of Law, Medicine,
Thank you, Dr. Austin, and I want to thank the sponsors of the dance lecture for inviting me here. Other UW. So I really am very happy to be here this evening to talk about an issue that I think that is very important to me and to those of you who are here in this audience. Tuskegee. 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 When you hear this word, what pops in your mind? I think that for most of you, the word evokes images of the infamous Tuskegee syphilis study. It probably does not evoke images of Booker T. Washington, the founder of Tuskegee Institute, or of George Washington Carver, the scientist, or of the Tuskegee Airmen, the pioneering World War II aviation pioneers. Today, the word Tuskegee usually brings to mind the 40-year study conducted between 1932 and 1972, in which the United States Public Health Service deliberately denied 399 black men from Macon County, Alabama, effective treatment for syphilis in order to document the natural history of the disease, or to do, as the Public Health Service said, to follow the men to endpoint, meaning to autopsy. Now, in terms of the study, I just want to briefly give a brief history of the study. I said the study was in Macon County, Alabama. Annually, there were so-called roundups of the men. The men were followed for their health care to see what was the impact of syphilis on their lives. The men were diagnosed in terms of how syphilis had an impact on many of the organs of their bodies. There's cardiac exams. Blood samples were drawn to see what was the ravages of the syphilis in the men. In this slide, I think is very powerful because, on the one hand, this man is having his blood drawn, but other people interpret this slide as the man being given syphilis. And one of the myths of the syphilis study has been that the men were given syphilis. The men were not given syphilis, but it's a myth that seems to be hard to shake. The men were denied treatment for their syphilis. They were being told that they were being treated. For example, spinal taps, the families were told that they were back shots. So the men were deliberately denied treatment, and they were told that they were being treated for their syphilis. All the men were in the late stages of the syphilis when the study began. Historian James Jones has called the Tuskegee syphilis study the longest non-therapeutic study in history. Published medical reports have estimated that between 28 to 100 men died as a result of their syphilis. The public first came to know about the syphilis study in July 25th, 1972. These are some of the editorial cartoons that came out at the time that the syphilis study was first brought to light. This is a slide of the first public revelation of the syphilis study. And I always talk about the public revelation in terms of the syphilis study, in that because it was known in the medical community. In the close to the 30 years that the story first broke, the study has moved from being a singular historical event to a powerful metaphor. Tuskegee has come to symbolize racism in medicine, misconduct in human research, the arrogance of physicians, and government abuse of black people. Tuskegee also represents a devastating wound for many black people. On May 16, 1997, President Clinton, in a very moving White House ceremony, apologized for the Tuskegee syphilis study. Actually, he apologized for the United States public health study at Tuskegee. An important corrective, I think, because it places responsibility for the study in the hands of the United States Public Health Service rather than those of Tuskegee Institute. Although facilities and staff of Tuskegee Institute were used in the study, primary direction for it came from the government under the auspices of the Public Health Service. At the White House ceremony, when President Clinton uttered the words, "I am sorry," tears streamed down the faces of many black people in the audience. Audible sobs could be heard. These tears vividly demonstrated that the pain inflicted by the syphilis study was not limited to the citizens of Macon County. For many African Americans, the fact that the Tuskegee syphilis study occurred at all proves that black life is often not valued in America. The Tuskegee syphilis study is the most well-known episode in African American medical history. In fact, this study was my very entry to a professional career that has focused on the history of race and racism in American medicine. In 1972, I remember sitting in the cafeteria of my college and reading about the syphilis study. I decided to do my senior thesis on the study, and in 1974 wrote my senior thesis on it. Friends have pointed out that close to 30 years later, I'm still milking my senior thesis from college. They just didn't choose as well as I did. And I strongly believe that we cannot forget the inhumanity of the syphilis study. But we cannot let it be the only lens through which we examine the history of African Americans in medicine. One historical event cannot fully explain the long and complicated relationship of African Americans in medicine. In addition, if we use the syphilis study as the primary lens to view the history of African Americans in medicine, we see African Americans only as victims and lose sight of the strength and resilience of the black community and the contributions of African American healthcare providers. History clearly reveals that African Americans have not been helpless victims in the face of oppression, but have developed strategies and institutions to provide care, improve health, advance black healthcare professionals, and to battle medical racism. The history of African Americans in medicine is not only about trauma and scars, but about strength, healing, and achievement. A wider history of African Americans in medicine shows what Manning Marable and Leif Mullen, two prominent African American studies scholars, have called voices of resistance, reform, and renewal. This evening, we will see that the history of African Americans and medicine is just not about Tuskegee. Our journey will focus on the 20th century. We will see how race and racism have played integral parts in the development of the American healthcare system. We will also see how black Americans have responded to these obstacles. Our journey will begin at the turn of the 20th century, at a time when racial customs and mores severely restricted black access to most hospitals. Hospitals in the North, and in the South, either denied African Americans admissions or accommodated them almost universally in segregated wards, often placed in undesirable locations such as attics and basements. In Newport News, Virginia, for example, black patients were housed in the city jail until the 1914 establishment of a black hospital, Whitaker Memorial Hospital. Hospitals worked to maintain the color line and even consciously developed mechanisms to do it efficiently. In a 1907 article in the Transactions of American Hospital Association, a white hospital administrator suggested the following creative scheme to ensure that patients and their personal effects would be segregated. And I quote, "The Negro department must always be as far from the white as possible. The equipments in all departments are practically the same. However, the linens, gowns, and every individual of the different departments must be kept as separate as if in different parts of the city. Say, for example, at a glance you can note where each article belongs, as all are marked in large letters. Cream and white blankets for white patients, slate-colored blankets for the colored wards." End quote. During the first half of the 20th century, the color line in medicine was so rigid that even medical emergencies did not bend it. Hospital segregation often led to tragic and at times fatal consequences. The November 1931 death of Juliette Derricott, Dean of Women at Fisk University, vividly demonstrates that hospital segregation had its fatal consequences. It also eliminates the limits of individual actions in the context of institutionalized racism. Ms. Derricott died after she was refused hospital care following an automobile accident in Dalton, Georgia. She received medical treatment from a white physician at the scene and later at his office. According to witnesses, the physician provided good and compassionate care, but because of racial discrimination, he could not admit her to a local hospital. Consequently, she was moved to a private home of a black woman who had no medical or nurse training. Apparently, the residence which witnesses described as filthy was where black patients in Dalton, Georgia received their care. Juliette Derricott remained at the private home for several hours and died after she was transferred 50 miles to the nearest black hospital, which was in Chattanooga, Tennessee. One friend remarked that her death was due to a hospital system that was, and I quote, "rotten and wicked and unspeakably cruel, because it would harm any poor, ignorant, wicked, unfortunate victim of an accident if he happened to be Negro," end quote. George White, the father of Walter White, Assistant Secretary of the NAACP, also died in 1931, and he too suffered the consequences of racial discrimination in medicine. Crossing a street in Atlanta, Mr. White was hit by a car and then taken to Grady City Hospital, where because of his fair skin, he was admitted to the white ward of the hospital. The quote-unquote error was discovered when Mr. White's son-in-law showed up at the hospital. Walter White, in his autobiography, described the scene at the hospital when Mr. White's true racial identity was uncovered. He wrote, "Do you know who this man is?" my brother-in-law was asked. "He is my father-in-law." My brother-in-law, whose skin was brown, replied, "Have we put a nigger in the white ward?" they asked, horrified. Father was snatched from the examination table, lest he contaminate the white air, and taken hurriedly across the street in a driving downpour to the Negro ward. At the time, the black ward at Grady Hospital was the only facility that admitted black patients. Walter White noted that the ward was infested with rats and roaches, and that, I quote, dinginess, misery, and poverty press so hard on one from every side that even a well person could not avoid feeling a little sick in these surroundings, end quote. George White had worked for the United States Post Office for 43 years and had always paid his taxes on time. But when death had come, his son bitterly remembered. He had been ushered out of life in the meanest circumstances. An implacable color line had decreed for all Negroes, whatever their character or circumstances might be. Racism also adversely affected the careers of African American physicians and nurses and underscored the importance of black institutions. Hospitals, nurse training schools, and medical schools frequently barred African Americans. The story of Lillian Atkins Moore clearly illustrates the plight of African American healthcare professionals during the first half of the 20th century. Moore, a senior student at Women's Medical College, Pennsylvania, applied for an internship at the college's hospital in 1923 with apparently unimpeachable credentials. She had been a good student, winning the freshman anatomy prize, and had been elected secretary of her senior class. Despite her achievements, she was rejected for an internship at the hospital associated with the medical school because she was black. Dr. Jesse Pryor, medical director at the hospital, admitted in a letter to Dr. Moore that race had been the deciding factor in the hospital's action. I have been told that we could not possibly undertake to give you a service here. We're all your good friends. And it is a most unpleasant thing to have to tell you that just because you are colored, we can't arrange to take you comfortably into the hospital. I am quite sure that most of the interns who come to us next year will not be able to give us as good work as you are capable of doing. Dr. Pryor did offer to help Dr. Moore get an appointment at one of the so-called colored hospitals. Moore finally secured a position at Douglas Hospital in Philadelphia. Ironically, in this case, racial discrimination came from an institution that had been founded in response to sexual discrimination in medicine. Dr. Moore's predicament underscores the importance that black hospitals once had to the survival of the black healthcare profession. Racism also threatened the career of Dr. Thomas Peyton. When he graduated from the Long Island College of Medicine in the early 1920s, he was the only black person in a class of 100. After graduation, he interned at Mercy Hospital, a black hospital in Philadelphia. After his internship, Dr. Peyton returned to New York to open a practice. After several years in successful practice, he decided to specialize in proctology. However, racial discrimination hindered his career aspirations. A New York hospital rejected his application because he was black. The hospital superintendent stated that patients would refuse to be treated by a black physician. Undaunted, Dr. Peyton went abroad and studied proctology in Paris and in London. When he returned to the United States, the racial barriers remained. White hospitals refused to provide him with admitting privileges, and specialty societies barred his participation in meetings. The American Proctologic Society rejected his application because he did not meet the requirement of being white. A requirement, Dr. Peyton quipped, God made it impossible for me to meet. Despite these obstacles, Dr. Peyton continued to write scientific articles and practice medicine in the separate black medical world. In his 1950 autobiography, A Quest for Dignity, Dr. Peyton lamented, "In the field of medicine, I know I could have done much more had racism never been encountered." Racism in medicine also cast a shadow on the career of Dr. Margaret Lawrence. When she arrived at Cornell University in 1932, she was the only black undergraduate on campus, and was not allowed to live in the dorms. She supported herself by working as a domestic for white families. Nonetheless, she did well academically, and her dream of going to medical school soared, especially after the dean of the medical school complimented her on her performance on the medical school aptitude test. After the examination, the dean called Lawrence into his office. She later recounted this meeting. I recall happily considering medical school, looking forward to my graduation, planning for my parents' arrival, working on renting an apartment for them to stay in. Then she heard the dean's words. He said that she was a very good student and a promising physician, but that the admissions committee had decided not to admit her. You know, he said, without a hint of emotion in his voice, 20 years ago, there was a Negro man admitted to Cornell Medical School, and it didn't work out. He got tuberculosis. Lawrence eventually gained admission in 1936 to Columbia Medical School, and once again, she was the only black student. Lawrence faced another hurdle. She was not allowed to work at Baby's Hospital, ostensibly because housing could not be provided for a black woman in the nurses' dorms, where the female interns and medical students were housed. When she got an internship at Harlem Hospital. We should remember that as an African American woman, racism was not the obstacle in Lawrence's professional path. At Meharry Medical College, a predominantly black medical school, she was the only black woman on the faculty in the early 1940s and encountered blatant sexism. She was excluded from intellectual camaraderie, overburdened with responsibilities, and poorly paid in comparison with her male colleagues. Margaret Lawrence went on to have a very distinguished career as a child psychiatrist. In the loving memoir, Balm in Gilead, Lawrence's daughter, Dr. Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot, eloquently demonstrates that trauma and the strength to overcome it were recurrent themes in her mother's professional and personal life. She also made plain that the subcutaneous scars of systemic racism was still with her mother, a woman who had all the markings of success. 50 years after her rejection from Cornell Medical School solely because of her race, Margaret Lawrence wept as she told the story to her daughter. Confronted with racism in American medicine, African Americans responded by establishing their own institutions, including medical schools, medical societies, medical journals, nurse training schools, and hospitals. Their exclusion from white professional societies prompted black physicians to found the National Medical Association in 1895 and black nurses to create the National Association of Colored Graduate Nurses in 1908. In 1891, Dr. Daniel Hale Williams, a leading black surgeon, opened Chicago's Provident Hospital, the nation's first black-controlled hospital. The racially discriminatory policies of Chicago's nursing schools provided the primary impetus for the establishment of Provident Hospital. After a young black woman, Emma Reynolds, was refused admission to all of Chicago's nursing schools solely because of her race, her brother, a prominent minister, turned to Williams for help. A committee of physicians, ministers, and community leaders tried, but failed to find a place for Reynolds at one of the city's nursing schools. The experience prompted Williams to organize a biracial association of medical and civic leaders to establish an interracial hospital and nurse training school in Chicago. Williams successfully solicited funds and supplies from both black and white citizens. Critical to the success of the endeavor were the activities of black club women who worked to raise funds for the association. In June 1891, only 5 months after the creation of the Hospital Association, a 14-bed hospital opened in this 2-story frame house. Unlike most black physicians who practiced at the end of the 20th century, Williams enjoyed wide contact and much prestige in the white community. He had graduated from the predominantly white Chicago Medical College in 1883 and had interned at Mercy Hospital, a Catholic hospital. In 1889, he became the first black physician named to the Illinois State Board of Health. Although Williams had access to the white medical world and called for Providence Hospital to be interracial, he understood the plight of the vast majority of African American physicians. After the establishment of Providence Hospital, Williams conducted surgical clinics at Meharry Medical College and at various black hospitals throughout the South. He acknowledged that racism, especially in the South, seriously limited the opportunities afforded black nurses and physicians, and adversely affected the health care that black patients received. He urged the black community to establish its own hospitals and nurse training schools. In a 1910 address before the Phyllis Wheatley Club of Nashville, Tennessee, Williams contended that, in view of this cruel ostracism affecting so vitally the race, our duty seems plain. Start hospitals and training schools. Let us no longer sit idly and inanely deploring existing conditions. Let us not waste time trying to effect changes or modifications in the institutions unfriendly to us, but rather let us seek to promote the doctrine of helping and stimulating our own race. During